to make it plain to everyone, and to this King Agrippa, and to us as readers, why it is that he is saying the things that he's saying, and where it is that he got his authority. See, he was not somebody who was following after Jesus and wanted to learn about Jesus so he could go and teach about it. He was an enemy. He was going the opposite direction. But what's he supposed to, what do you do then when a supernatural thing like this happens and a light shines and you fall down to the ground and you hear a voice speaking, "I'm Jesus"? He's confronted with Jesus himself speaking to him out of this bright light, but Jesus is not done. Verse 16, he goes on to speak to him. "But rise, stand upon thy feet, for I have appeared unto thee for this purpose, to make thee a minister and a witness, both of the things which thou hast seen," in other words, that which is taking place right now, "and of those things in which I will appear unto thee." So he says, I have chosen you, Paul, and I'm going to make you a person might be standing there like an observer hearing this. You might be tempted to say, "Wait a minute, Jesus. Wait. Don't you know he's an enemy? You don't understand this." Later on, if you go and reading the book of Acts, Paul, after this is over with, he's blind because of the brightness of the light. And so Jesus then appears to a disciple of his in another city and says, "Go and pray for Paul that he can receive his sight." And this man his name's Ananias, and he says to Jesus in this vision, "Jesus, maybe you haven't heard about this guy Saul. Maybe you haven't read the latest news. He is an enemy." See, here Jesus knows don't you think he knows he's an enemy? Yeah, but you know what? Evidently Jesus doesn't care that he's an enemy. He comes to a man and he says, he knows all about him. He just comes to him and says, "But I have chosen you to make you a minister." Now you might think he could choose somebody better than this to make a witness. But he says, "This is the one I want." He can do whatever he wants to do. Did you know that? Jesus, he just does what he can. Another interesting thing about this, I don't know why I think these things, but he already had some disciples. What about his 12? What about Peter and James and John? They're over at Jerusalem. They're over there praying. They're trying to get the church going. He could have at least informed them of what he was doing. He didn't bother to even tell them. He didn't have to tell anybody. He doesn't need permission from anybody. He can go and just do what he wants to do. So he goes to this guy, Saul, and he says, "I have appeared to you, and I want you to be a witness about what you've seen." And of course, he's telling it right here. "And of the which I will," he says, "I will appear to you." And then he gives him a summary of what it is he's supposed to do. "Delivering thee from the people," that means the Jews, "and from the Gentiles," that's the outsiders. In the Jewish mind, of course, this is all taking place in the context of the Jewish world. In the Old Testament, God had a people, a covenant people. Those were the nation of Israel, the Jews. Those were his covenant people. And everybody else were the Gentiles, the outsiders. And they looked down on the Gentiles, the outsiders. They didn't think they were there. They'd call them dogs. And you know who? I say they. That's us, by the way. They would have considered us to be outsiders, unfit, unqualified dogs. Why? Because we're not part of the covenant. We weren't part of their covenant. But Jesus here comes to Saul, who will be soon to be Paul. And you know what? The reason is because now there's a new covenant. By Jesus coming, and you know why he was put to death? The Romans did it for their own reasons. The Jews conspired, the leaders, for their own reasons. But God had a hand in it, and what God was doing was he was allowing Jesus to pay for the sins that were defined under the Old Covenant. The Old Covenant defined what righteousness was in the eyes of God and what sin was. And Jesus lived a perfectly righteous life to fulfill God's requirements for man. Because you know what? Here's the I'm jumping ahead a little bit. You and I can't do it. See, people who read the Old Testament and look for all the laws and the rules and regulations, you're barking up the wrong tree because you don't have it in. You cannot fulfill it. Well, you say, I can do the best I can do the best I can do. No, it's not a matter of doing the best you can do. You got to be perfect. And there's only one perfect one who perfectly fulfilled God's righteousness. That's Jesus. Amen. He is the only one who perfectly fulfilled what God put down as the requirements in the Old Testament. Only him, nobody else. So God's got a man now that has perfectly fulfilled his requirements of the Old Covenant. And not only that, the Old Covenant defined punishment for sin, which is death. Jesus didn't have any sins of his own. So he was, by God, by the grace of God. So here's how Hebrews says it. The book of Hebrews tells us that Jesus, by the grace of God, tasted death for every man. Well, what does he mean by that? Well, the punishment for sin is death. And so God, because of his great love, we sang in the song this morning, he's merciful and righteous. He's merciful and righteous. He's merciful to us, and because of His mercy, He allowed Jesus to fulfill His righteous requirements. And He let Jesus go to the cross and pay for the guilt that was ours. He was our substitute. And now, because Jesus has done that, He has fulfilled everything to do with the Old Covenant. All of its requirements for righteousness and all of its demands for punishment for sin. It's all paid for by Jesus. So you could say it's been folded up, put away. It's just like a loan, at the bank. If you have a loan at the bank and you finally pay it off, they fold it up, put it away, and stamp paid in full. It's not in force anymore. It's just a historical document. Is that right? And now, having put away that old covenant, Jesus has made a new covenant. And in this new covenant, there's no more Jews and Gentiles. Everybody can be a part, because it's all based on Him. So, here's the thing about it, though. Not everybody understands that there's something new going on. Did you know 2,000 years later, here we are, 2,000 years after the events we're reading about, think about how long it is. 2,000 years, and I would still say the majority of people don't understand there's a new system. I think most people are under the Ten Commandments system, the Old Covenant system, the system that tells you that it's all about you. Is that okay? There's a new covenant, and it's not about you, it's about Jesus.
Amen.
Okay, now here's the guy. Paul, this is Saul. He's an enemy. Jesus appeared to him, delivering thee from the Gentiles. That's the outsiders. Unto whom I now send thee. I'm sending you to them. And I say them, that's us. You and I. And why? Verse 18. To open their eyes, to turn them from darkness to light, and from the power of Satan unto God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and an inheritance among them which are sanctified. By the way, sanctified means made holy. Holy by faith that is in me. So, he sums it up, whereupon, O King Agrippa, verse 9, I was not disobedient to the heavenly vision. In other words, he said, I saw this. What's he supposed to do? He's seen this. Now he's got no, he could either ignore it, but how could you ignore something like this? So this changed his life, and he began to act on what Jesus had said to him. Now, this is why Paul is authoritative, why we can read a letter that he wrote to the Romans and take it to the bank, so to speak. We can rely upon what he says. We can count on it because where did he get this information that he's conveying in this letter to the Romans? He got it from Jesus. He didn't get it from Peter, James, and John. In other of his epistles, he tells that. He said, the gospel that I'm preaching, I didn't get it from men. I got it from Jesus. Nobody taught it to me. So he is, you could say, when you're reading what he has to say here, you're reading what Jesus gave him to give to us. Well, I've talked to people, you might have, I don't know if you ever thought this way, but I've seen people, I've talked to people before and said, well, if Jesus wants to get my attention, he can just appear to me in a bright light by the side of, oh, listen, he doesn't do that to everybody. That's not his ordinary mode of operation, to appear in a bright light and knock you to the ground. That's just not his. What he chose to do was do Paul that way. And then Paul go preach. And then Paul wrote some letters. I guess he knew. Jesus is pretty smart, I guess. He knew this guy Paul couldn't keep it to himself and would go and preach. Not only did he preach, he wrote letters. I think when Paul wrote these letters, he had no conception of the fact that we would gather them up, put them in a book called the Bible. They didn't have a Bible then. They had the covenant. They had scrolls. When they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found all these little scrolls. They had individual scrolls. They had their scriptures. They call it the scriptures. The idea of what we have, the Bible, like a library of all these things, Paul had no clue that we would take his letters. But see, Jesus knew that Paul just couldn't keep his mouth shut, and he would be telling everybody. And so listen to this. I'm going to read to you I'm going to start with verse 16. I'm going to skip the introduction and start right in verse 16. And Paul is writing, listen to this now. He's writing to a group of people that he doesn't really know. He's just heard there's a group of Christians in Rome. And he is so convinced about the information he's gotten from Jesus. He said, I heard there's a group of Christians over in Rome. In the first part of the verses 1 through 15, he says, I've heard of you. I've heard of your faith. And basically what he's saying, if I can just paraphrase it, he says, you need to know what I've got to tell you. I've got information that you need. Now this shows a lot of, what would we call this? We call it chutzpah, almost like arrogance. But he knows he's got something they need. Where'd he get it? From Jesus. He's heard there's some Christians, but he said, you need to know, listen, I've got some information hot off the wire from heaven, from Jesus, and you need to know what it is. Now with that in mind, let's begin to read a little bit. verse 16.